Sukuk is very similar to a conventional bond. The only difference is that it's governed by Islamic financing law, which is premised on Sharia law. And what does Sharia law say in terms of issuing Sukuk bonds? Essentially, you cannot charge interest, one, and you cannot use the proceeds of the facility into what we term haram or non-permissible uses. That's really what a Sukuk is versus a conventional bond. So when you structure a Sukuk versus a conventional bond, you need to bear in mind those two factors. One, that you can't charge interest, and two, non-permissible uses of the facilities. Non-permissible uses are very similar to what from a conventional banking you wouldn't do, but certain banks can do them because if you have those mandates, you can. For example, for Islamic law perspective, you cannot use the financing for gambling, for example. Or in some strict sense of the law, you cannot even fund food proceeds that are not halal. So those are examples of what is non-permissible from an Islamic financing perspective. A lot of people think Islamic financing, or from a Sukuk perspective, can only be done by Islamic people or Muslim companies or entities. But that's not entirely in itself true. Any issuer can issue a Sukuk as long as they're complying with those two factors that I just mentioned. And the main reason why an ordinary issuer would want to issue a Sukuk is mainly from a diversification perspective. So from a diversification perspective is that you ordinarily, from a conventional banking perspective or conventional bond, you wouldn't have access to Islamic financing money that's out there. And if you're aware of the markets from a cash flux perspective, you'll know that from the Middle East and the Gulf states that there's a lot of cash flux and a lot of demand for such assets. And as such, you can tap into a relatively larger investor pool versus what you can from a conventional bond perspective. So hence, a lot of issuers who've already issued in the conventional bond market go to issue in the Sukuk market only to diversify the investor base and attract a different kind of investor than they ordinarily attract in a conventional bond. So I think from a returns perspective, one, if you're an issuer, we'll talk about the investor from an investor side, but if you're an issuer, because you have a broader base of investors, you are likely to have better pricing. You know, higher the demand of your bonds, the lower your pricing is likely to be. So from an investor perspective, I guess the one factor that I've mentioned is that you have two different types of investors. You'd have a conventional investor who really doesn't really matter for them whether this thing is Sukuk or not, or Islamic financing or Sharia law compliant or not. And for them, they'll be looking for a diversification of their own assets. And also, sometimes you find that given that an issuer who's issuing in the Sukuk market, maybe a relatively new issuer in the Sukuk market, might pay a little bit of a premium to what the conventional bond market demands. And as such, you'll find that the pricing may be, for a short period of time, may be a little bit higher on the Sukuk side versus the bond side. So you'll have investors looking at such opportunities and buying on the Sukuk side versus on the conventional side. But there are other investors such as the Islamic, who are bound by Islamic or Sharia law. In that case, for them, they're constantly looking for different assets, given that there are very few assets from an Islamic financing perspective. So an ability to open a Sukuk market much wider to just the Gulf issuers, to other issuers on perhaps the African continent or other regions, that opens up a diversification element for their portfolios as well. RMB's role in facilitating Africa Finance Corporation's Sukuk, our maiden Sukuk I should highlight, was a lead manager and book runner role for their 3-year Sukuk facility. They were targeting $100 million, of which we managed to raise $150 million, where the book was over 2 times oversubscribed. The client chose not to increase the facility way above 150 and just manage it at 150, but that could have potentially happened if they had appetite for higher amount. From a pricing perspective, our initial pricing guidance was 10 basis points above where we landed, given the high demand for the facility. I said it was 2 times oversubscribed, and as per my initial thoughts on it was that if there's a high demand for your asset or for your loan or your bond in this case, there would then be a pricing benefit for you. The same thing happened, and that's what we saw on the day when we priced the facility, is that from a pricing perspective, we were able to reduce it from our initial guidance to 10 basis points below. So I think from an Islamic financing perspective, RMB is able to facilitate a number of structures, and there are quite a lot of structures that you can do from a Sharia law perspective. And I'll talk about the popular ones in a minute, but I just want to emphasize that from an Islamic financing perspective, if you have a natural asset where we don't have to structure an asset, that's a perfect classic example of what you should be doing from an Islamic financing perspective, because you're really funding a purchase of an asset versus buying debt. Like for a conventional bond perspective, you'll be buying a debt instrument, but from a Sukuk perspective, you're essentially buying assets. And the same way, we're able to facilitate, for example, here with AFC, we did the Sukuk. We can do a Murabaha structure, where it's a cost plus, you're buying an asset at a cost plus. Structure a loan, what we would call a conventional loan, whether it be syndicated or not. We can structure that. We can do an Ijara facility, which is a sale and leaseback facility, typically used for asset-backed financing or property finance. You can also do that. And there are a number of other structures we could use, but it's quite important that you touch base with us here at RMB in terms of what you're really looking to do and which type of investors you're looking to tap into, and we'll help you with the appropriate structure for that.